All right, so we had some pretty wild breaking news this morning because the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was straight up assassinated while he was going to campaign for a member of his own party. So, here from Common Dreams, we got a breakdown on some of the basic details surrounding the actual assassination. Then we're going to get to absolutely delusional conservative responses to this. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Shinzo Abe and his style of politics because, obviously I'm not openly in favor of assassinations by any stretch of the imagination, but this guy Shinzo Abe definitely was a controversial figure in Japan, to say the least. So, here from Common Dreams, they got a breakdown. They say Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe assassinated on campaign trail. And they say Shinzo Abe was fatally shot on Friday as he delivered a campaign speech on behalf of a member of his party just days ahead of the country's parliamentary elections. Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister, was rushed to a hospital with wounds to his neck and left collarbone apparently inflicted by a blast from a homemade shotgun. Hours later, news broke of Abe's passing. And they say police arrested the suspected gunman on the scenes. And the Financial Times reported that authorities in Nara, where the shooting took place, named the suspect as Tetsuya Yamagami, a resident of the city with no known occupation. But according to the Defense Ministry, he served in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force from 2002 to 2005. So this part of it is kind of interesting that he was a former member of basically the Japanese Navy, because that could potentially, we don't really know the true motive here yet, but could potentially play a role in the motivation for this attack in the first place, because as we're going to get to here in a second, Shinzo Abe definitely had a controversial view on the Japanese military posture. So we're going to get to that, but first, let's just check in with conservatives having an absolutely normal one in response to this. So here from Laverne Spicer, a Florida GOP congressional candidate, she said, "How did Shinzo Abe get assassinated when guns are banned in Japan? Liberals care to explain." So she really thought that she had a good point here that she was making, but it really doesn't take much details or research to understand exactly how this was done. First of all, you can see here from the picture, this is the assassin in question, and if you look here at the gun, I mean it's a homemade shotgun. It looks like it literally has like tape around it to put together this double barrel mini shotgun basically. But also, if you actually go and look at the assassination footage, which will be in this article down in the description below if you want to actually go and watch it. Obviously, I can't play it on YouTube, but you'll see that it seems like from the footage that he basically missed the first shot. At least that's what it looked like. It seemed like the bodyguards who were standing around Shinzo Abe didn't really at first recognize that it was a gunshot, because Japan really doesn't have a proliferation of guns like we do here in the United States. Gun violence is extraordinarily rare, and we'll get to a statistic on that here in the next article. But again, I mean, he had a homemade shotgun. He probably missed the first shot, then got lucky on the second shot and ended up shooting him in the back and killing him. But I mean, obviously this isn't a problem with a gun control in Japan, or it's not making the point that gun control is ineffective in Japan by any stretch of the imagination, because again, if you just go look at some of the basic statistics here, we got one from CNN. They say in 2018, Japan, a country of 125 million people, just like a third the population of the US, only reported 9 deaths from firearms. 9 deaths from firearms in an entire year for a country of 125 million people, compared with 39,740 that year in the United States. So listen, again, you have absolutely no fucking point that you're making here. Clearly, Japanese gun control, while some may make points that it's overreaching or that it goes too far, fine, that's okay if you want to make that argument, but to pretend as if gun control is completely ineffective because there was one shooting of a high-level politician is just completely fucking delusional. I mean, again, it bears it out here in the statistics. 9 deaths in 2018 compared to 40,000 the same year in the United States. So clearly, if anything, this is an indication that their gun control measures are working on that front. But now we get to the real meat of who Shinzo Abe actually was as the former Prime Minister of Japan. So again, not in support of his assassination. I don't think that that's acceptable or should be commended by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless, we should get into some of the details of exactly why he was deemed a controversial figure within Japan. So here from the New York Times, we got a breakdown. They say the leader who was Trump before Trump. Under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan has taken a decidedly authoritarian turn. So What are they talking about here? Well, they start off saying Steve Bannon, Mr. Trump's former chief strategist, was dead on when addressing lawmakers from Mr. Abe's ruling Liberal Democratic Party in March. He said Abe was Trump before Trump, and he meant this as a compliment. And they say Mr. Abe, he reportedly said, was the first nationalist leader to win an election in and then govern an industrialized democracy. A great hero, according to Steve Bannon, absolute fucking right-wing reactionary lunatic. But they say indeed, back in 2012, long before Mr. Trump promised to make America great again, Mr. Abe had campaigned on a similar slogan of "Take Back Japan." And Mr. Abe has repeatedly argued that Japan needs to escape from the post-war regime and break free from its pacifist constitution that the Allied forces drafted for it after its defeat in 1945. So he wanted to take this constitution, which basically said that the Japanese military can only act in a defensive posture, and he wanted to change that so that they could basically have the authority to launch a war without being attacked first. So pretty militaristic, obviously, but they continue saying Mr. Abe once remarked that the the document was a disgraceful constitution, and he prompted massive protests in 2014 and 15 after bypassing the constitutional provisions that unambiguously commit Japan to renouncing war. And rather than seeking a formal amendment to the charter, Mr. Abe radically reinterpreted the legislation that his party rammed through the parliament, known as the Diet, and now Japan can go to war without even being attacked, as long as the government deems that the nation's survival is in danger, as vague as that obviously is, obviously intentional as well. But they continue on other different fronts, saying that civil liberties and press freedoms have also taken a hit under the Abe administration. The state secrets law, which gives bureaucrats virtually unchecked discretion to decide what is a state secret, was enacted in 2013. And in 2017, it was an anti-conspiracy law that gives authorities sweeping surveillance powers over suspected criminals. And Yoshihide Suga, the chief cabinet secretary and government spokesperson, has signaled out and bullied a particularly inquisitive female reporter. And Japan's ranking in the World Press Freedom Index fell from 11th place in 2010 to 67th this year. Again, you see the authoritarian tendencies here. But they continue saying, even as it tries to silence its critics, the government has displayed a great tolerance for extremist and bigoted views in its midst. And Taro Aso, Mr. Abe's deputy prime minister and finance minister, drew criticism in 2008 when he was the secretary general of the LDP by likening the Democratic Party of Japan, the main opposition group, to the Nazis who had brought disasters to Germany. But then in 2013, he cited Nazi techniques as a model for how to revise Japan's pacifist constitution. And they said Germany's Weimar Constitution was changed before anybody knew. It was changed before anyone else noticed. Why don't we learn from that method? Why don't we learn from the method of the Nazi techniques in overhauling the Weimar Constitution towards a much more aggressive militaristic posture? That's the questions that, members within his party were asking. And they say also in 2013, Shigeru Ishiba, sorry if I'm butchering that name, the then Secretary General of the LDP, said that public protests against the state secrets bill were an act of terrorism, and Mr. Abe kept both men in their posts long after they made those comments. And they say, and just last year, Mio Sugita, an LDP lawmaker and protege of Mr. Abe, said that same-sex couples don't produce children, adding that they lack productivity and therefore do not contribute to the prosperity of the nation. Okay, so far we have hyper-militarism, we have, comparisons to Nazi strategies in terms of overhauling their constitution towards a more militaristic attitude, and on top of that, we also have suppression of speech, lack of press freedoms, we also have deeming public protests as an act of terrorism, and finally we have very anti-LGBTQ views. But they continue saying the Abe government's penchant for historical revisionism, for glorifying Japan's wartime past, for denying that the Japanese military committed atrocities is well documented. Several photos have emerged showing the LDP's policy chief and two members of Abe's cabinet with neo-Nazis and far-right hate groups. And in 2016, the minister in charge of Okinawa affairs refused to denounce a police officer's pejorative and racist slurs such as natives and Chinamen against protesters opposing the presence of the United States military bases in the prefecture. And again, Mr. Abe did not dismiss any of these ministers. And they say the Abe administration is, in other words, rejecting the rules of the democratic game, denying the legitimacy of its opponents, curtailing the civil liberties of dissenters, and tolerating or encouraging some forms of hate speech, all precisely the indicators of budding authoritarianism that the political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt warned about in their 2018 book, How Democracies Die. So again, obviously, somewhat tragic situation with him being assassinated, especially as he's on the campaign trail. But nonetheless, when you look at his historical record, the record of his party members, not too much to be commended there. So, at the end of the day, obviously not in favor of assassinations or anything like that, but clearly this guy was not some sort of a trailblazer for democracy or human rights within Japan. And how this is going to end up affecting the domestic political situation within Japan, I guess that's yet to be seen. Could actually produce benefits for his party and give them more of a mandate for controlling the politics within Japan, which I think would be probably disastrous, but we'll have to see exactly how this plays out. And also, stands to be seen exactly what the motivation was for this assassination. So should be interesting to hear from the guy who actually did the assassination and what potential reasons or explanations or justifications that he saw in his mind for committing this attack.